welcome to today's webinar looking at how standardized assessment can form an integral part of supporting student progress in a world without levels. My name is Phil Wileman and I'm the Field Training Manager here at GL Assessment. Over the next half an hour or so, I really want to give you an idea of how standardized assessment can play a part in a wider assessment regime within school and fully support looking at the pupil from all kinds of different directions to get the very clearest picture we can of their developing needs. Just to start with a little bit of a reminder of perhaps why we're here. It was just 3.5 years ago that the government announced a major reorganization of the national curriculum. What it did was remove the assessment framework, the national curriculum levels. Of course, national curriculum is still with us, and in fact, first was placed into primary schools some 28 years ago. I was actually a head of department, not in primary, but in secondary 28 years ago, so I remember that pretty clearly. And I should say that at the time, it wasn't terribly well received. So just to make the point here that, you know, there was a time before national curriculum levels, and I can assure you that children were being taught, they were learning, and progress was being made. But, okay, the here and now, without the national framework of assessment, it has led to a little bit of concern, I would say, because we've had virtually an entire generation of teachers who have known nothing else apart from working to a government-imposed series of assessment levels. And now without them, without having a replacement for them, some have felt a little bit at sea and felt that perhaps their students, their pupils, are being set up as guinea pigs in a kind of giant educational experiment. But I do want to reassure you that long before national curriculum levels, we were doing really good work in schools, and there is no reason why that shouldn't be going on now and be improved upon. What have we got in terms of guidance? Well, the initial guidance from the DFE, let's say, is minimal. Just harking back to those 28 years ago when national curriculum came out, I was head of science, and I remember getting something like 17 folders of information stating exactly what should be taught. Now, in terms of generalized guidance in developing your own system, it's much more minimalistic. I should say that it's around the idea of the freedom to design your own system. And I truly believe freedom is very important to be clear to other stakeholders, and in his case he was also talking about the inspectorate, but really not a great deal of detailed guidance on what should be in an assessment structure. Of course, now we have Amanda Spielman, who is heading up Ofsted. Have we had anything much more on this? Really only to reiterate the importance of progress measures. So, if we really are left to get on with this for ourselves, I think it's very important that we try and design a system that works for us within the school. Anything we design really shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all imposition, but is something that we know will work for the children in our school. Having said that, there are some guiding principles, I would suggest, about types of assessment that make them better or worse for particular tasks. Here at GL Assessment, we're really asking ourselves and others this question about assessment. Will this assessment provide good quality information? And mostly, importantly, can it be used to act upon with students to improve their teaching and learning? Will it also inform parents, governors, other stakeholders, and vitally, the pupils themselves in next steps? So, in the process of designing this system then, what do we have to consider? Well, we need assessments, we need information that will help us inform decisions at key points. These needs, and many, many more. But if we look at key transitions from phases, perhaps, from year to year, from key stages, we also need information, as we said before, to inform stakeholders. We need more regular assessment to monitor student progress, and even more regularly, perhaps day to day, we need that vital formative feedback to give us information on next steps for teaching and learning. So what information do we need? Who's going to be using it and what for is going to guide us into what kind of assessment tool we need to do that job. Okay, so let's just explore some terms that are widely used alongside assessment. Criterion-referenced, summative, normative assessment. What's best? What's the best kind of assessment? What assessment of those should I be using? Well, the answer is probably a bit of everything. I wouldn't say there was an assessment that was intrinsically good, intrinsically bad. Certainly, it's what use we make of them. And for me, really, they are tools. They are a way of doing a job. And I think if we view it that way, it's how well they do that job in producing the information we need that's important, and not the type of assessment itself. Okay. So let's just have a little walk through some of those assessment terms and see what they mean and see what they bring to the table, as it were, in this system of assessment. Well, let's start off with really what was at the backbone of national curriculum levels. It seems a good place to start. And believe me, I've heard many an opinion on national curriculum levels, and some that I couldn't repeat here. But certainly, one of the things that they could do was to give some idea of comparability nationally. If we might not agree on exactly what it meant to be a 4A or a 3C, we would know certainly that it meant I could do a certain number of pre-designed items. Whether that told me that I was good in English, good in maths, or so on, is perhaps up for argument. But what they could do is I could say, if somebody had a 4A in Aberystwyth and a 4A in York and a 4A in Southampton, I would have a way of directly comparing those students and know that they had achieved a similar set of skills and capabilities. So, criterion reference pretty much is a list of things, a list of items. They might be skills, they might be knowledge, they might be, as I say, capabilities, but it's a list of things, a bag of skills. And with the national curriculum, we put together bags of skills and labelled them up with a number. Now, the problem with this is putting those skills in any kind of hierarchical order to actually show progression is terribly difficult. And it's also terribly difficult to get agreement on between different practitioners. But I think perhaps the biggest downfall of national curriculum levels was this second point on here, that yes, you might be able to define a set of individual items that a student could do or not do, but that really didn't tell you. They might be good at punctuation, they might be able to use a semicolon, they might be able to use capital letters, but did those components come together to say that they were good at English, good at writing a compelling piece of narrative, for instance? Well, there I think we can all agree there was a failing. What about criterion reference that isn't there supporting national curriculum levels? Well, we know that criterion referenced is this list of items then, and this can often form the basis of things like learning ladders and mastery systems. Learning ladders again, does suffer through that problem of being able to agree a hierarchical progression. Having a long list of items that children must or must show capability in also brings into play things like tick lists. And we also have to decide, just because a student can show capability once in something, does that mean it's embedded? We have to agree on how many times or in what areas these skills have to be shown. So there are problems with this kind of system. Certainly, we need agreement. We need rigorous moderation within school. But either system we've looked at so far in terms of criterion referencing doesn't allow us to make comparisons between different schools. It doesn't allow us to make comparisons in performance between different subject areas. This is very much around the individual and an individual subject. Now that's great for formative assessment. Yeah, if I want to know the next steps, I need to know what the child can and can't do now. A bit of, examining where are the gaps in the hedge, working out how we can best fill those gaps and move students on. Less good for actually determining any kind of level of absolute competency, you could say. What about standardized assessments? Well, standardized assessments have got something of a bad reputation, particularly with colleagues in primary. And I don't really know why that should be, because a standardized assessment is really simply one that is done in a standard, repeatable way. And we do it in a standard, repeatable way so we can be confident that the results we get from it are actually meaningful. And the ones that are produced here at GL, for instance, and at other places that produce standardized assessments, actually will allow that competency I've talked about before, allow you to make that comparison from one student to another, from one assessment to another, from one school to another. A little bit more detail on standardized assessments then. So I've mentioned that performance that we see on the assessment, allowing us to reference it to national samples. Sounds rather grand, but basically all we do is produce assessments that are trialled in different schools, representative of the UK sample. From that UK sample, we can be confident that particular scores represent particular levels of competency compared to other students across the UK. And just because they're normative, if you like, or have that national benchmark, doesn't mean they can't also be helpful summatively. They can sum up the performance level of a student on a particular body of knowledge, a body of curriculum. And if we are using standardized curriculum assessments, we can also reference parts of that curriculum. So they can have elements of formative information. Yes, this is often broad brushstroke, but it is guidance on the relative strengths and areas of development of an individual within a curriculum area. Just to help clarify that, I think if we have a look at this made-up end-of-term report, and it's for a made-up student, and that's the kind of report you wouldn't get now, but many decades ago when I was at school, that was probably quite close to the kind of report I would get. Maybe not those scores. Science, 78%, maths, 52%, English, 68%. And I just want to sort of rhetorically ask these questions. In which subject is Tom doing the best? Well, it would certainly be very tempting, I think, to say science. It's the highest percentage. Doing about average for his group. Well, 52 sounds about the middle. Beating most of the other students in class. Well, again, the temptation, I suppose, would be to say 78. I'm being A little bit devil's advocate here, I'm sure you appreciate. Most likely to get a top grade at GCSE. Again, the 78 calls, I think. But of course, you will have recognised, just as I'm trying to get the point across, that if I don't know whether those assessments are equally difficult, I can't in any way compare them. What if the science teacher actually had set just a extremely easy and accessible test just to check that people had taken on board knowledge of a particular topic? What if a maths teacher had chosen an external examination that was actually at a higher level than he was actually teaching, just to get an element of challenge in? Then that comparison of simple raw numbers would be meaningless. What standardized age scores do for you is not only give you a score, but they show what that score means in terms of how many other students is that score better than, and not only within the group, but nationally. We can get a position of a person's score in terms of their performance in a national distribution. More than that, we can link those scores, those standardized scores, and map them to external examinations, such as the scaled score at the end of Key Stage 2 that the government has recently introduced. So we can still use these standardized scores to map to external reference assessment, and which is not possible in any kind of assessment that you develop for yourself in-house. Just to continue that theme a little bit about standardized age scores and how they could be useful, because it's a common scale between all of these assessments, and because it is always produced in the same way, I can use that scale to have real meaning. So when I get reports or scores that say 100 on a standard scale, I know that that performance level is UK national average. And because these scores are standard age scores, I know that would be the average level of performance in that assessment area for that particular age group, which I think is particularly useful. And because it is produced in this standard way, I can say things like people who have a score of 85 or less, those scores are only achieved by the bottom 18% of students. So that can help flag up those that might be in need of support across the curriculum. I'm only picking out a few main points here, though. If they get a score of 121 or above, I know that that level of performance is only achieved by the top 10% of the population. Really useful, again, for flagging up those high achievers, making sure they're being stretched, checking that this is my expectation of them in school. And it really is that. It's about using these normative information alongside the formative, the informal assessment. It's about taking different strands and weaving them together to get that clearest picture. If progress is so important, how can we use standardized age scores for progress? Well, what we do if we produce this report, which is from one of our assessments, but the scheme is the same throughout. If we look at two things, if we look at how students' standardized age score changes from year to year, and we check the number of students or the percentage of students that make that change, we can actually produce these bands of progress. We look to see what change in standardized age score from one assessment to another is actually achieved by the middle scoring group of students, and we label that expected progress. And using real data from the assessments, we can band that progress around that expected group, so we can identify those students who are making smaller but still significant progress above the average, those slightly below, those well below, those well above. And this is actually linked to real data year on year. I should just explain one feature of standardized age scores that sometimes confuses people, and that is, it's best done through an example perhaps. If I do an assessment that is designed for 10-year-olds, and I'm 10, and that would be nice, but I was a 10-year-old and I get a standardized score of 100, I know I've got average performance for a 10-year-old. If I then do the assessment a year later, now I'm 11, and I do the assessment designed for 11-year-olds, and I get 100. I'm now an average 11-year-old performance. So it was 100 last year on the 10, 100 on the 11. That looks the same. It is the same, but I've actually maintained my position in the distribution. I was at an average level of performance for a 10-year-old. I'm now at the average performance of an 11-year-old. I've made 1 full year's progress. And this scatter graph is very much about progress. It's not about moving people from, it's showing absolute levels of performance. It's not about just high flyers or whatever. Each student's progress can be fitted into those bands to make sure that I can clearly check that progress is being made for all students of all performance levels. Just a reminder, though, that any test score, whether it's an informal one or a formal one, is not a tablet of stone. It's not Moses appearing with the laws of God. It is a snapshot. It is, especially where you do one-off formalized assessment, it is a one-off. And here you really have to choose quality. It's like taking a picture. If you use a poor camera and poor film, you get a poor picture. Also, I should say that any test or anything, just asking questions in class or one piece of work in a child's book reveals only one piece of the jigsaw. It's only when those pieces are put together that we see that picture starting to reveal itself. So to finish off, really, I want to just explain how those principles of partnership and complementing assessments have come together in this model that we're calling the whole pupil view at GL Assessment. For us, and I don't think it's any surprise, we're all in the business of doing the best we can for children. So the child is at the center of this. Around the outside, the biggest circle is a recognition that most assessment on children is done by you in the classroom, one-to-one. You're aware of all that contextual information that we're not, all of that individual information, all of that professionally reached information that we're not. What do? We bring to the table things that are hard for you to do, that bigger picture, that taking together of individual items and melding them into a level of competency or performance. We've chosen to look in 3 areas: where children are now, that's attainment; where they perhaps could be in terms of how well they take on new information, ability; and then using those together to try and develop rigorous assessments. Rigorous, yes, but still will give us information on individuals where perhaps barriers are holding them back from achieving that ability level. So just to recap then, for us it's very much a bringing together of different sources. No one assessment is good, bad, or ugly. They are tools, and like any tool, if you're building a house, you have to use many tools in many different ways. Okay, I hope that's been useful for you. And we do have a question or two, so let's see if I can have a look. My colleagues have been making hurried notes as we go through. So I think one that's come up several times from different people is, what have levels been replaced with in GL assessments? Well, let me just unpick that first, just to make clear that what have levels been replaced with by the government would be a nice answer and very simple answer: nothing. There are no governmental replacements, and really the basis of today's webinar has to be to say, it's up to us guys, let's make the best assessment we can scheme out of what we've got available. Okay, now to focus on the part of that is GL. Well, standardised age scores have always been part of GL assessments, and we will continue to use those because that is the way of making these comparisons and getting those distributions that clearly show national competency levels. However, we are aware that it would be really useful to you to have some way of mapping or referencing these scores against other assessments that, to be honest, you have to do. So with us here in primary, our biggest concern probably in terms of that mapping would be end of Key Stage 2 and that scaled score. Well, I'm pleased to say that we are now in a position to give guidance that maps our standardised age scores to scaled scores from the end of Key Stage 2. And that will start appearing on reports very soon. So that is a real step forward, and the national curriculum levels, if you are old school, as it were, and you still want to use those for a kind of backward reference, even we do have the facility of making those available to you. It just won't be the kind of default position, as it were. If we've got any secondary colleagues joining us today, the same goes for GCSE, really. We're already in the position that we can map standardised age scores to GCSE grades and numbers while we're in this transition period between the two. So I hope that's cleared up that little bit of confusion for you. And I think, in fact, that was probably the main question area we had. So thank you very much. I hope it has been useful. If you're not joining us in the flesh, as it were, please email to us if you have any questions when you're viewing this as a recording. We'd be most pleased to answer them. So thanks again. Have a nice rest of the day. Thanks very much.